Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Abrams, it's been over 2 years, and you still refuse to concede that you lost the race for governor in Georgia in 2018. You have said that, quote, you do not concede that the process was proper, and that, quote, they stole it from the voters of Georgia. Yes or no, today, do you still maintain that the 2018 Georgia election was stolen?
As I have always said, I acknowledged at the very beginning that Brian Kemp won under the rules that were in place. What I object to are rules that permitted thousands of Georgia voters to be denied their participation in this election or to have their votes cast out. And so I will continue to disagree with the system until it is fixed. We have seen marked progress made, and unfortunately it was undone in SB 202. But I will continue to advocate for a system that permits every eligible Georgian to cast their ballots.
Ms. Abrams, I'm going to ask you to please answer the question I asked, which is, do you, yes or no, do you still maintain the 2018 election was stolen? That's your language.
My full language was that it was stolen from the voters of Georgia. We do not know what they would have done because not every eligible Georgian was permitted to participate fully in the election.
So you also told the New York Times that your loss, quote, was fully attributable to voter suppression. Ms. Abrams, do you know in Georgia whether the percentage of African-American Georgians who are registered to vote and who turned out to vote, is it higher or lower than the national average?
It is higher than the national average because Georgia is one of the largest states with an African-American population.
But that's not tied to the size of the population. The percentage of black Georgians who are registered to vote in 2018 is 64.7%. That compares to 60.2% as the national average. The percentage of Georgians who voted in 2018, the election you claim was stolen from you, was 56.3%. That's higher than the national average of 48%. Let me ask you this, Ms. Abrams. In 2018, do you know which demographic group in Georgia had the highest registration percentage and the highest turnout percentage?
I have a guess, but I will defer to you for the answer.
The answer is African Americans had the highest registration and the highest turnout, despite your claiming that the election was stolen and there was somehow voter suppression. Let's shift to the Georgia law in particular, which there have been mountains of lies spread by both Democratic politicians and by the press. Does the Georgia law reduce the number of early voting days? Yes or no?
Yes. It does so because you have to look at it in toto. It is not simply looking at the number of days that were expanded for 40% of the population, which for 60% of the population had been the norm. It also has to look at the early voting runoff days that were indeed shortened.
If you add is it correct that the law increases the number of mandatory days of early weekend voting?
It is a partial answer to say that certain days were increased in certain counties that had not participated in the use of all of those days of elections. They had been optional, and most 60% of Georgians had been able to vote for those full number of days. 40% will now join, and that is a good thing. But at the exact same time, this same bill eliminates weeks of early voting during runoff elections and limits and allows the elimination of weekend voting.
Do you believe that requiring an ID to vote suppresses votes?
As I have said, written, testified, and have repeated today, I believe that voter identification is always appropriate. You should know who's voting. What I object to are the ways that we are narrowing and restricting who has access to the right to vote, and that has been a common and necessary complaint. As we noted in 2018, what happened to Native Americans in North Dakota who were denied the right to vote because they were required to have photo identification that included language and included perquisites that they were not entitled to demand. When we have narrowing of opportunities without expansion of access, that is absolutely wrong, and I will stand against it in Georgia and everywhere.
During the 2020 election, did your organization, Fair Fight, collect ballots for voters? And if so, were the people collecting ballots for your organization paid?
We did not collect ballots. We did not pay people to collect ballots. We sent to voters absentee ballot applications, as did the Secretary of State, as did a number of other organizations, because in the midst of a pandemic, we thought it was important for voters who may or may not have had information about what their rights were to ensure that they had the education and opportunity for engagement in our elections.
So I want to be clear about your testimony to this committee. Your testimony is that your organization did not pay any person in the state of Georgia in 2020 to collect ballots for anybody else.
No, sir.
Okay, thank you.
From Georgia, Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel for joining us. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record a number of statements which may clarify for some of our colleagues the motives and circumstances that led to the passage of this infamous law in Georgia. Without objection. This is Georgia's Republican Lieutenant Governor, Jeff Duncan, who said about the law, quote, "This is really the fallout from 10 weeks of misinformation that flew in from former President Donald Trump." He further said, "There is solutions in search of a problem. Republicans don't need election reform to win. We need leadership." That was on Meet the Press. He further said in an op-ed in USA Today, knee-jerk reaction legislation, such as not allowing the distribution of water within 150 feet of a polling station just to appease the extreme right corners of legislators' districts and to avoid primary challenges. Ms. Abrams, in the exchange that you just shared with Senator Cruz, the question of early voting opportunities was raised. Can you please clarify for this committee what has changed about early voting and runoff elections in Georgia under this new law and what the impact might be of those changes?
Certainly. In the state of Georgia, previously, the law said that elections occurred during business hours. Most 60% of voters were able to vote between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., which is the hour of operation on Election Day. And so for the majority of Georgians, the time allowed was from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. The law now mandates that it be 9 to 5 p.m. with the option. The challenge with an optional permission is that it is no longer a given, and we have a number of counties that have taken options as an opportunity to restrict access. We celebrate the fact that more voters will have access to weekend voting, but it is not an expansion of a right when 60% of Georgians previously enjoyed that right. We know that 78% of Georgians were able to vote. The actual days and weekends. We know that 78% of Georgians were able to vote during those earlier voting hours, and that's what's being constricted. We know that, for example, in the state of Georgia, we have 159 counties, but some of our counties have a small population as fewer than 2,000 persons. And so it is insufficient to simply look at the number of counties participating. You have to look at the populations that are participating. And we know in the state of Georgia that this law is restricting access to the right to vote. We also know that the optional notion of a Sunday vote, for example, was something that counties felt that they had the right to do, and we had a number of counties that were already using Sunday voting. So yes, to the extent that it is clarified in the law, that is one thing, but to claim that it is an expansion of access for the majority of Georgians is not only untrue, it is misleading, and it is false.